Welcome to this explainer. Let's just jump right in, shall we? If you've ever wondered why launching a new business into a well-established industry feels less like starting a company and more like, well, launching a medieval siege against a heavily fortified castle, you are in the right place. Today, we're going to unpack exactly why invading a new market is basically like besieging a fortress. We'll be looking through the strategic lens of Michael Porter's five forces, examining the deep moats, the towering walls, and the archers waiting for any newcomer brave or maybe foolish enough to charge the gates. To really grasp the gravity of what we're talking about here, let's kick things off with a pretty jarring statistic. Academic studies on market entry reveal that a staggering 90% of all new entrants use an imitative strategy. Basically, they look at what the big established companies are doing and they just try to copy it. And the results? The vast majority of them completely fail. In fact, studies show that 5 to 10% of these newcomers just outright disappear within a few years of launching. It is literally a slaughter out there on the competitive battlefield. So that naturally brings us to our pivotal question for today. Why is it just so incredibly hard to break into a new market? Why do so many well-intentioned, well-funded businesses crash and burn so fast? Well, the answer lies in understanding the brutal economic and strategic forces at play. It's all about the massive advantages that incumbent businesses, the ones already sitting comfortably inside the fortress, have built up over years or even decades to keep newcomers out. To figure this out, we need to zoom out and look at the macro map of the competitive battlefield, which is Porter's five forces. Porter realized that an industry's profitability isn't just about how you go toe-to-toe with your direct competitors. It's actually this massive tug of war fought on multiple fronts. You've got the bargaining power of your suppliers, the bargaining power of your buyers, the threat of substitute products, the rivalry among existing competitors, and finally, the threat of new entrants. And sitting right at the top of that battlefield map is our primary focus for today, the threat of new entrants. This is the constant risk that new businesses are going to enter the market, add a ton of new production capacity, and spark a fierce, margin-crushing competition for market share. What's really fascinating here is that even the mere threat of entry, literally just the possibility that someone might invade, forces existing companies to keep their prices low and heavily invest in their defenses, just to make the industry look less attractive to outsiders. Moving on to Section 1, Building the Moat, or Barriers to Entry. See, if you're an incumbent firm, you don't just sit around waiting to be attacked. You build a moat. Incumbents construct a variety of deep, treacherous moats, strategically known as barriers to entry. These barriers are specifically designed to jack up the financial requirements for newcomers while simultaneously crushing their expected profit margins. Because if you need massive capital to build factories, or if you have to overcome immense brand loyalty, your journey as a newcomer goes from just difficult to nearly impossible. Let's look a little closer at a few of these. A perfect example of the brand loyalty moat is Johnson & Johnson. They have practically ruled the baby care segment for 60 years. Massive giants like Wipro or Himalaya have tried to break into this market and had very little success. Why? Well, because when it comes to their babies, mothers absolutely do not want to risk experimenting with new, unproven brands. They want products they completely trust. That 60-year reign of trust is a heavy psychological barrier that money alone often just cannot breach. But let's say the customer isn't just emotionally attached to a brand. What if they are practically chained to it? This brings us to switching costs. These are the one-time costs, the pain, the friction a customer has to bear to switch from one product or vendor to another. This is a massive defensive barrier that keeps customers locked securely inside the incumbent's fortress. The really crucial point to remember is that switching costs aren't always just a slight inconvenience. Sometimes they are absolutely astronomical. Take enterprise software, like an SAP ERP system, for example. Once a company has spent millions of dollars and years of labor installing SAP to run their entire business, the cost of ripping all that out and moving to a new vendor is financially crippling. This means that even if a new entrant shows up at the gate with a genuinely superior software product, the customer is effectively trapped. They literally cannot afford to switch. Another incredibly solid wall is the network effect. This happens when a product becomes more valuable the more people use it. Think about Microsoft's historical lock on Office productivity software. Because everyone else uses Word and Excel, you essentially have to use them too if you want to seamlessly share files. For a new entrant, this is a highly unattractive scenario because they can't instantly offer that same expansive, dominant ecosystem. You're basically asking people to join an empty party. And hey, we can't forget about basic distribution. Sometimes just reaching the buyer is a huge hurdle in itself. In the consumer goods industry, supermarket shelf space is finite and it's heavily guarded.
New entrants often have to literally buy their way into these distribution channels using what are called slotting fees. That basically means paying supermarkets just to stock their product or offering deep price cuts to retailers. That squeezes the new entrants' profit margins before a single customer has even picked up the product.
All right, Section 2, the archers, or expected retaliation. Okay, let's play devil's advocate. Say a newcomer is exceptionally well-funded. They manage to swim across the moat of capital requirements, they scale the walls of brand loyalty, they figure out distribution, they are inside. Well, now they have to face the archers. Established firms do not just roll over and surrender their market share. They will fight to the death for their home turf. They'll slash prices, they'll hold clearance sales, they'll launch ultra-aggressive promotional campaigns, and flood the market by leveraging their excess capacity. The entire goal here is to make the entrance journey incredibly painful and ultimately totally unprofitable. Now, how vicious this retaliation gets usually depends on the battlefield you're entering. Our sources draw a really sharp contrast here. In a growing market where buyer demand is rapidly expanding, entry is naturally a bit easier. There's enough new business floating around that newcomers can grow without having to violently steal customers from the incumbents. But a mature market? Completely different story. Demand is either slow growing or shrinking. It's a zero-sum game. Every single customer you win is a customer stolen right out of the incumbent's pocket, which virtually guarantees a fierce, bloody battle. This is exactly why mature markets act as such a massive deterrent. They naturally decrease the threat of new entrants because the established companies already possess these well-oiled, highly efficient cost advantages plus massive economies of scale. They've already paid off their factories. They've already mastered the learning curve. A newcomer trying to fight a price war against a mature incumbent is just at a severe foundational structural disadvantage. Which brings us to Section 3, breaching the walls and the rules of offensive strategy. So, considering the deep moats, the high walls, and the relentless archers, is it completely hopeless? How do you actually breach the walls without getting destroyed? Remember that 90% failure statistic we talked about at the beginning? Well, here is why they fail, summed up perfectly by Michael Porter. The cardinal rule in offensive strategy is not to attack head-on with an imitative strategy. You absolutely cannot just copy the incumbent. If you try to fight them on their own terms, playing by their own rules, their massive scale and brand loyalty will absolutely crush you. To survive, an entrant has to innovate. They have to disrupt the market entirely, finding a totally new angle or a new technology to bypass those heavy defenses completely. But let's flip the script for a second. What's the strategic takeaway for the defending incumbents who are sitting comfortably inside the castle? Well, you cannot get complacent. To avoid being leapfrogged by a clever, innovative attacker, incumbents have to continuously monitor and improve both the quality of their core product and their broader ecosystem of complementary products. Because if an incumbent lets their quality slip, they are basically lowering the switching cost for their own customers, which is practically inviting an attacker to swoop right in. So as we wrap up this explainer on the threat of new entrants within the broader framework of the 5 forces, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to apply to your own business strategy. When you look at your company, whether you're the established giant defending your turf or the scrappy startup trying to break in, ask yourself, is your strategy an innovative siege designed to brilliantly bypass the traditional defenses, or are you just gearing up for a doomed imitative frontal assault? The answer to that question might just be the difference between your business thriving or becoming part of that 90% failure rate. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep thinking strategically.